Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It's Friday. Woo! All right, that was very, very low key. Woo! All right, Friday. It's Friday, April 26th, and everybody knows what April 26th is. It's April 26th, 2024, and time for another show. End of the week. That's great news, I guess, because bad things happen during the week and good things happen during the weekend. I don't know. The news stops? Nothing. None of that is true. But for some reason, we all celebrate Fridays. And usually it's about not getting up and heading into the office tomorrow. But then again, many of you probably will have to do that. Although, or head wherever it is you work. If you work from home, every day is the same. And it doesn't matter. So, happy Friday, everybody. There's lots to be... all right, there's not that much to be happy about. Yesterday was Supreme Court arguments in perhaps the most ridiculous case the Supreme Court has agreed to hear in, I don't know, in a century, or maybe ever, and we can recap some of that. All the things that you thought would happen, happened. All the people you thought would entertain this stupid and impossible idea, entertained the stupid and impossible idea, and the people who you thought would be skeptical of it were skeptical of it, and now we roll the dice and find out whether we all understood the Constitution from the beginning or not, whether we were all pre-wrong. This is another, I don't think there's any more crystalline example of it, of the concept of what I call, which isn't even a great name for it at all, the idea of being pre-wrong about these things, that all your life you grew up, I think longtime listeners to the show know this one already, but all your life you grew up thinking you understood this basic precept of the Constitution, only to find out that one day, five robes got together and for whatever reason, strategic advantage in an upcoming political campaign, an ongoing decades-long political campaign to seize power, just wanting to be famous. I don't really know what drives it all the time for everybody. It's a mix, I'm sure. But finding out that they're going to stand there and look you in the eye and say, no, you were always wrong about this. And not only are you wrong now, you were always wrong the whole time before. And we were just snickering at you and laughing at you behind your back about how wrong you were. There was no need to correct you. So the 235 years or however long it's been now, I don't know. I've lost track of this stuff. After 1976, I never knew anymore. But I did have a commemorative quarter. I did get that in the exchange. Anyway, 200 and X number of years later, you all thought that the president wasn't above the law and that the whole purpose of the Constitution was to constrain him from things like that. There was this little mix-up just prior to 1976 where we found out that at least one president thought he was right about those things and everyone was pretty wrong. But you find out not only are you wrong now, but they maintain that you've always been wrong. We've just never had the need to correct you before. But this is what the founders intended, and so therefore, what can I tell you? You're wrong. A good example of it brought up today via social media, although, did I put it aside or anything? No, of course not. But what one was I talking about? Here we go. It was easy to find. A Blue Sky post from Neil Lewis Jr., Do I know Neil Lewis Jr.? Neil Lewis Jr. is a behavioral scientist and science communicator and an associate professor at Cornell University. How do you like that? So, Weil, W-E-I-L-L, Cornell Medicine as well. So, wow. Well, what do we say? Behavioral science communicator, professor at Cornell. Are you a medical professor? Teaches at the medical school. As well, maybe that's the behavioral science part, science community. Does a little bit of everything. That's a smart person. Well, anyway, Neil Lewis Jr., for one thing, he'd know how to get on a radio program and have his throat clear before he because it's a medical guy. But, well, what am I saying? Greg can't. All right, but Greg treated kids for so many years that they were always making him sick. Anyway, the point is, that Mr. Lewis here, Professor Lewis, I guess, it doesn't say so in the, well, it does, doesn't it? It said, yeah, professor at Cornell University. So there we go. Okay, I was like instructor. What does he call himself? Professor Lewis says that he found this part of what I believe is Jamelle Bouie's opinion piece from today particularly interesting, about what the founders explicitly said about immunity. And I think, yes, we might as well recap what happened yesterday at the Supreme Court. He is referring to Jamelle Bouie's piece published this morning. This whole King Trump thing is getting awfully literal, is the title that they slapped on it. I don't know whether that was Jamel's idea or not, but this is the excerpt, and he's given us the screenshot of it. James Iredell, one of the first justices of the Supreme Court, as it turns out, just coincidence. I don't know why we should listen to the guy, just because he was one of the first Supreme Court justices. Anyway, he told the North Carolina ratifying convention, probably called the North Carolina ratifying convention. I don't know what the accents were like then. Curious. Anyway, he told that ratifying convention why, if the president, quote, commits any misdemeanor in office, because they would obviously never commit crimes in their view, but if they did, if they committed any misdemeanor in office, he is impeachable, removable from office, and incapacitated to hold any office of honor, trust, or profit. We've come to a slightly different understanding of that now. Not one, never removing anybody from office, but two, I believe the current thinking is that there would have to be, in addition to a conviction in an impeachment, an explicit finding of disqualification for office, that it requires an explicit say-so. I suppose you could do it in the same vote if you set up your rules that way, but it's not necessarily the case that an impeached and convicted individual will be barred from office forever without the explicit say-so of the Senate. That was an interesting misunderstanding, but let me just give you his quote. If the president commits any misdemeanor in office, he is impeachable, removable from office, and incapacitated to hold any office of honor, trust, or profit. And if he commits any crime, now he's actually addressing that, well then, quote, he is punishable by the laws of his country, and in capital cases, he really went all out here, in capital cases may be deprived of his life. Well, okay, he was a product of his times. Capital punishment. Well, we don't talk about that often enough, really, when it comes to Donald Trump. But, people frown on it, whatever. I'm willing to entertain the idea just because I'm an originalist. What can I tell you? I give wide berth, a vast deference. And you medical students can laugh about that one. Anyway, to James Iredell as one of the first justices of the Supreme Court, in his opinion, that were the president to commit a capital crime while in office, he is subject to impeachment, removal from office, incapacitated to hold any office of trust, honor, or profit. Of course, hard to do when you're dead, but subsequently, were it a capital case, he could be deprived of his life. You can execute a president who commits a capital crime while in office, which is kind of the opposite from the concept that Donald Trump is trying to introduce here of absolute immunity for presidents. By the way, former presidents as well, maybe even for crimes that they committed before they became president, because once you become president, your whole life is charmed and gilded from start to finish. There's no crime you can be charged with. Yes, you read that correctly, Jamelle tells everybody. In his argument for the Constitution, one of the earliest appointees to the Supreme Court specified that in a capital case, the president could be tried, convicted, and put to death. Well, not many people are saying that these days, but it's out there. And as I was saying, there's perhaps no clearer indication, no clearer example of what I call being pre-wrong about basic constitutional concepts. And as I explained, you spent your whole life believing that the opposite was obviously true. There is no such thing as presidential immunity, let alone absolute presidential immunity, let alone immunity post-presidency. But then one day, 5 people who happen to have the right color robes get together and say, you're now wrong. There is such a thing. There always was such a thing. You just didn't know it. You were too dumb. You weren't listening at Federalist Society meetings. They had a fancy name for it back in the day when I learned about it first, which was they described these precepts that you and I had never heard of, and that there was no schoolhouse rock about it because it was assumed that the opposite was true. But they knew that there's secret language written in between the lines of the Constitution, which survives in their mind as the Constitution in exile. That was sort of the fancy name that kind of sort of got hung on what overlaps, at least, with this concept I'm describing to you, that there were things that, in their view, the founders absolutely did mean to be the correct originalist interpretation of the Constitution, but had been lost over time or exiled by liberal activist justices on the Supreme Court, changing the interpretation of the Constitution such that the original intent was now living, still surviving somewhere in exile, but would be brought back by conservative justices. And everyone would be reminded 200 years later, oh yeah, that's right. The founders actually did mean to set the president up as an absolute dictator and king, despite the context of the Revolutionary War. Which is, what they're arguing. We're sitting here watching them do that. I might as well tell you, in Jamel Bouie's probably better and more organized words, what that actually all means. And there's lots of writing about it, because it was kind of an outrageous moment. But actually, I think, I'm not certain whether, the thing I told myself before I started was that I would limit the focus to the most outrageous example of it, that Justice Alito and what he was, his line of questioning and his argument, so more or less, from the bench during what was supposed to be an argument presented by the 2 litigants. But anyway, you know how justices are. They jump in and participate in these things. And I don't know. There's a Vanity Fair piece, if I can open it up again here, by Bess Levin that summarizes his position. And maybe we can jump over to what Jamel has to say about it, because it's always worth hearing. And it's Friday. Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito argues presidents must be allowed to commit federal crimes, or democracy as we know it will be over. That does seem odd, right? Normally, you try that one in, not only law school, but any civics class, junior high school. Can the president, is anybody above the law? Is the president above the law? No, says the class. But someone stands up and says, actually, it's essential to democracy that they be considered above the law. Go to the office, Alito. I don't want to hear it. Incredible logic, says the subheader, from the conservative wing of the court. Capitalized, of course, because it's the Supreme Court, and there's no appeal after that. On Thursday. It was a Thursday, but this was this particular Thursday. The Supreme Court heard oral arguments for and against Donald Trump's claims of absolute presidential immunity. The good news is that the court appeared unlikely to just completely rule in his favor, agree that he should not face prosecution for anything he did in office, and kill the federal election case against him. The bad news is that, unsurprisingly, they're not just going to tell him to F off. As some justices suggested that presidents should receive some immunity, a move that would potentially limit special counsel Jack Smith's case and delay a trial until after the November election. By the way, probably telling him that there was no such thing as presidential immunity and that he should F off will still likely delay his trial until after the election. And a good point also, I must say, observed today on social media. I'll see if I can give credit for it by finding it when I retweeted it, but probably not. Oh, yes, here it is. Steve M., that is to say, the old No More Mr. Nice Guy blogger. But Steve M. has had this to say. I credit it with being pretty close to true, if not dead on. If the Supreme Court was to give Trump partial immunity, which seems very likely, he'll say that he was given absolute immunity. He'll say this over and over and over again, often in all caps on his Truth Social platform, the way he used to repeat no collusion, and at least 45% of the country will believe it's true. That's definitely something to look out for. The Supreme Court will say it its way, and then what we do with the interpretation of it, well, hey, that's not their problem. So, yes, not only that, but it will delay the trial. The insane news, now that we've gotten the good news and the bad news, now the insane news, that conservative Justice Samuel Alito literally tried to argue that we should allow presidents to commit crimes without fear of prosecution in order to save democracy. Did everybody catch the argument? If you didn't have time to listen to it or catch up with it last night, that's right. Speaking to Michael Dreeben, the and attorney, it says and attorney, but an attorney representing the special counsel, Alito began by stating, quote, "I'm sure you would agree with me that a stable democratic society requires that a candidate who loses an election, even a close one, even a hotly contested one, leaves office peacefully if that candidate is the incumbent." Then, having started with a premise that all reasonable people would agree with, he went in with this. I mean, we all do agree with that part, right? But now the next part. If an incumbent who loses a very close, hotly contested election knows that a real possibility after leaving office is not that the president is going to be able to go off into a peaceful retirement, but that the president may be criminally prosecuted by a bitter political opponent, will that not lead us into a cycle that destabilizes the functioning of our country as a democracy? I mean, it's an interesting question, but there is an old adage that goes along with it. If you can't do the time, don't do the crime. One option for avoiding all of that is not criming. But I think Alito's concern here is, well, what about if the next administration makes up a crime or makes up evidence that you committed such a crime? Well, I don't know. I understand the theoretical question here, fabricated evidence, a fabricated charge even. It would be very difficult to deal with. It's a problem we've pondered and a problem we've seen throughout our history. But I thought that ultimately our trust that this wouldn't happen and could happen, but wouldn't happen in the main was supposed to be, I think, deposited with you, the Supreme Court. You're the branch that's supposed to guarantee that that stuff doesn't fly if someone tries it. But I guess you just don't have that much confidence in yourself. I don't know. If your brain hurts from trying to follow Alito's logic, what he's saying here is that presidents need to know that they'll never be prosecuted for any crime they might commit in office, or else democracy will collapse. Because future office holders might, say, try to overturn a free and fair election in order to stay in power and avoid criminal charges. And if that sounds completely absurd to you, you're not alone. Responding to Alito's hypothetical, Dreeben said, "I think it's exactly the opposite, Justice Alito." Yeah. Alito's desire to literally let presidents do anything that they want could, of course, lead to terrible outcomes, which liberal Justice Sonia Sotomayor unfortunately had to point out. Apparently, her formulation of it included an embedded tweet here. Sotomayor saying, if the president decides that his rival is a corrupt person and he orders the military to assassinate him, is that within his official acts for which he can be given immunity? And that was put to John Sauer, the Trump attorney in all of this, to which he answered in the affirmative, as it happens. Anyway, it's obviously good news that the court is unlikely to endorse Trump and seemingly Alito's claim that presidents should enjoy absolute immunity for anything they do in office. And remember, Trump also claims it for things they do after office and maybe before. as well. But it's really, really quite bad that the likely outcome of the proceedings will still be a huge win for the ex-president. According to the New York Times, they're reporting from it, she borrows from here, there did not seem to be a lot of urgency among the justices, especially the conservative ones, to ensure that the immunity question was resolved quickly. That left open the possibility that Mr. Trump could avoid being tried on charges of plotting to overturn the last election until well after voters went to the polls to decide whether to choose him as president in this election. And if he is elected president, all of this will obviously go away. Okay, well, let's see. Some other commentary in the form of embedded tweets are included here. Oh, look. A very good question that he would probably answer by citing 17th century laws to argue the lady president should be thrown in jail. What is this? This is Elie Mystal saying about empty wheels. Marcy's question here. I so wish somebody would ask Alito this. Here's a question Alito should be asked today. If a female president got an abortion during her term, could Idaho arrest her? Ooh, that is a good question. I just wondered, my formulation of it was, could a president finally, quote unquote, grab all the guns? Like, could he just say, to hell with the Second Amendment, you all have to give me all of your guns? And just assuming he's able to pull that off, would anybody have any rights against him as for that? Let's see. And then a stop giving him ideas comment for an Aaron Rupar tweet that reads, Trump lawyer says that if Trump sold nuclear secrets to a foreign adversary, really, he couldn't be prosecuted unless he was impeached and convicted first. But then, of course, what would you impeach him for if the thing that he did was not a crime? Don't forget that part. I don't know why they didn't speak about that, I don't think. I don't know. Someone must have discussed it at the oral arguments at some point, but a point that was being, I don't know, underplayed in all of this is if you know that there was such a concept as presidential immunity, let alone absolute presidential immunity, and you caught somebody dead to rights in the middle of a murder and brought an impeachment resolution to the floor of the House, there would be members, presumably of that president's party, saying, what's the crime here? What are you impeaching him for? Well, it's the murder. Yeah, but there's absolute immunity. Well, that doesn't mean that it's not a crime. Then there is that argument. It's a crime. We can't punish him for it in the legal system, but we still can impeach him and remove him from office. Although then there will be people voting in the Senate saying, no, I vote not guilty because there's nothing that a person could be punished criminally for happening here. It says high crimes or misdemeanors, and there's no crime at all here. And you would see them walk. All right. Well, so that was the Alito argument, and I guess the shock of the day. And why don't we head into the first break by reading a little bit of Jamel Bouie's formulation of what happened yesterday. And we'll see whether we want to just continue and round some other opinion up. But I mean, I think we're all kind of in agreement on the opinion side. A lot of other stories that we could get to, but there has to be a segment on this today. Jamel writes, Donald Trump's claim that he has absolute immunity for criminal acts taken in office as president is an insult to reason, an assault on common sense, and a perversion of the fundamental maxim of American democracy that no man is above the law. You should, of course, be saying person. More astonishing than the former president's claim to immunity, however, is the fact that the Supreme Court took the case in the first place. That's true. It's not just that there's an obvious response. No, the president is not immune from criminal prosecution for illegal actions committed with the imprimatur of executive power, whether private or official, a distinction that, by the way, does not exist in the Constitution, but that the court has delayed, perhaps indefinitely, the former president's reckoning with the criminal legal system of the United States. In delaying the trial, the Supreme Court may well have denied the public its right to know whether a former president, now vying to be the next president, is guilty of trying to subvert the sacred process of presidential succession. He is guilty of that. The peaceful transfer of power from one faction to another that is the essence of representative democracy. It is a process so vital and so precious that its first occurrence, with the defeat of John Adams and the Federalists at the hands of Thomas Jefferson's Republicans in the 1800 presidential election, marks a second sort of American revolution. Whether motivated by sincere belief or partisanship or a myopic desire to weigh in on a case involving the former president, the Supreme Court has directly intervened in the 2024 presidential election in a way that deprives the electorate of critical information, or gives it less time to grapple with what might happen in a federal courtroom. And if the trial occurs after an election in which Trump wins a second term and he is convicted, then the court will have teed the nation up for an acute constitutional crisis. Thanks so much. A president, for the first time in the nation's history, might try to pardon himself for his own criminal behavior. In other words, however the court rules, it has egregiously abused its power. That is a good way of looking at it. It is difficult to overstate the radical contempt for Republican government embodied in the former president's notion that he can break the law without consequence or sanction on the grounds that he must have the right as chief executive. As Trump sees it, the president is sovereign, not the people. In his grotesque vision of executive power, the president is a king, unbound by law, chained only to the limits of his will. This is nonsense. In a detailed amicus brief submitted in support of the government in Trump versus United States, 15 leading historians of the early American Republic show the extent to which the framers and ratifiers of the Constitution rejected the idea of presidential immunity for crimes committed in office. Although the framers debated a variety of designs for the executive branch, ranging from a comparatively strong unitary president to a comparatively weaker executive council, they all approached the issues with a deep-seated anti-monarchical sentiment. The brief states, there is no evidence in the extensive historical record that any of the framers believed a former president should be immune from criminal prosecution. Such a concept would be inimical to the basic intentions, understandings, and experiences of the founding generation.
Sup fam, it's your boy Darwin, aka Darwin_Darko, aka the most reasonable man in America, aka KITM's senior black correspondent. You might remember me from such recordings as Spacemen vs. Space Cadets and We Need to Talk About Joe Biden. Today, I want to bring you good news about that thing you've been struggling with. Do you suffer from giving too much of a damn? Do you turn on the series of tubes and find yourself outraged at the particular way some news organization strung some sentences together only to realize, nope, this is not some fictional hellscape? Well, guess what? You no longer have to accept the life of giving too much of a damn. You can do something about it, because even you, yes you, can be a show contributor. Now I know what you're thinking. Hey, Mr. Most Reasonable Man in America, I'm not some professional podcast talking guy. Don't worry about it. Do you have a smartphone or some other electronic recording device? Well, that's all you need. You too can have a segment where you can read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Fair warning though, side effects may include general punditry, having opinions and hot takes, getting stuff off your chest, and hearing your own voice. If your recording lasts longer than 5 to 7 minutes, please consult kagrox@gmail.com. That's KAGROX@gmail.com.
All right, welcome back, everybody, to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on At Roots Radio. Let's run through some more things. We got a lot to get to here. We'll speed read, if we can, through some of this, get through the rest of Jamel Bowie's formulation of things, as you may have heard, or maybe not, as we sometimes fade out in the live show on our way into the musical break. But yes, as the 15 historians in the amicus brief put it, there is no evidence in the extensive historical record that any of the framers believed a former president should be immune from criminal prosecution. Such a concept would, and I'm sure you probably could have said something similar right along with me, such a concept would be inimical to the basic intentions, understandings, and experiences of the founding generation and, the 25 generations since. The historians gather a bushel of quotes and examples from a who's who of the revolutionary generation to prove the point. In America, the law is king, Thomas Paine wrote in his landmark pamphlet Common Sense. For as in absolute governments the king is law, so in free countries the law ought to be king, and there ought to be no other. James Madison thought it, quote, indispensable that some provision should be made for defending the community against the incapacity, negligence, or perfidy of the chief magistrate. That would be the president. Of course, the presidency was designed with accountability in mind. Years later, speaking on the Senate floor, Charles Pinckney of South Carolina, a delegate to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, said outright that he and his colleagues did not intend for the president to have any privileges or immunities. No privilege of this kind was intended for your executive, nor any except that which I have mentioned for your legislature. What's more, as the brief explains, ratification of the Constitution rested on the express promise that the new president would be subject to criminal conviction. His person is not so much protected as that of a member of the House of Representatives. Tench Coxe wrote in one of the first published essays urging ratification of the Constitution. This is how they sold it, right? For he may be proceeded against like any other man in the ordinary course of law. That would have been extremely important and extremely influential in convincing people to adopt the new Constitution. Well, what about this new president? Sounds scary. Powerful position. Could he use it to subjugate us in the future? Answer, no, I promise. All right. But now I'm dead, so go ahead, I guess. And then, of course, the James Iredell quote read earlier. Yes, we did at that time. Read that correctly. I'll skip it over and say, in his argument for the Constitution, one of the earliest appointees to the Supreme Court, Iredell, specified that in a capital case, the president could be tried, convicted, and put to death. He is punishable by the laws of his country. If there were ever a subject, on which to defer to the founding generation, it is on the question regarding the nature of the presidency. Is the president above the law? The answer is no. Is the president immune from criminal prosecution? Again, the answer is no. Any other conclusion represents a fundamental challenge to constitutional government by one branch of that constitutional government, which is a little bit amazing. I wish I had faith in the Supreme Court that would rule unanimously against Trump. But having heard the arguments, having listened to Justice Brett Kavanaugh worry that prosecution could hamper the president, and having heard Justice Samuel Alito suggest that we would face a destabilizing future of politically motivated prosecutions if Trump were to find himself on the receiving end of the full force of the law, my sense is that the Republican-appointed majority will try to make some distinction between official and unofficial acts and remand the case back to the trial court for further review, delaying a trial even further. Rather than grapple with the situation at hand, a defeated president worked with his allies to try to overturn the results of an election that he lost, eventually summoning a mob to try to subvert the peaceful transfer of power. The Republican-appointed majority worried about hypothetical prosecutions against hypothetical presidents who might try to stay in office against the will of the people if they aren't placed above the law. It was a farce befitting the absurdity of the situation. Trump has asked the Supreme Court if he is in effect a king, and at least 4 members of the court, among them so-called originalists, have said, in essence, that they'll have to think about it. So that's where we stand. Well, okay, there's more to consider in this. On the serious side, it's you really can't just stop there. If you have an offering available from Dahlia Lithwick and Mark Joseph Stern, and we do, it's here in Slate, the last thing this Supreme Court could do to shock us. This is interesting. There will be no more self-soothing after this, sort of describing this situation among court watchers who haven't yet, woken up to the reality of things. For 3 long years, Supreme Court watchers mollified themselves and others with vague promises that when the rubber hit the road, even the ultra-conservative Federalist Society justices of the Roberts Court would put democracy before party whenever they were finally confronted with the legal effort to hold Donald Trump accountable for January 6th. There were promising signs. They had, after all, refused to wade into the Trumpian efforts to set aside the election results in 2020. They had, after all, hewed to a kind of sanity in batting away Trumpist claims about presidential records, with the lone exception of Clarence Thomas, too long marinated in the ginny-scented Kool-Aid to be capable of surprising us, but he was just one vote. We promised ourselves that there would be cool heads and grand bargains, and that even though the court might sometimes help Trump in small ways, it would privilege the country in the end. We kept thinking that, at least for Justices Brett Kavanaugh, Neil Gorsuch, and Chief Justice John Roberts, the voice of reasoned never-Trumpers might still penetrate the Fox News fog. We told ourselves that at least 6 justices, maybe even 7, of the most MAGA-friendly court in history would still want to ensure that this November's elections would not be the last in history. Political hacks they may be, but they were not lawless ones. Well, of course she's kidding. On Thursday, during oral arguments in Trump versus the United States, which is an amazing title, the Republican-appointed justice, just stop for a second and think about how, this isn't the only one either. There's going to be a couple of cases styled this way. Trump versus the United States. Those are the stakes. Which side are you on? Anyway, on Thursday during oral arguments, the Republican-appointed justices shattered those illusions. Amazing. Although, really, of course, these two have seen this coming for a long time. They're really talking about other pundits, but I don't think they're copping to having believed this for the last 3 years. But it is interesting to hang 3 years on it unless they're talking about themselves. This was the case that we had been waiting for, and all was made clear. Brutally so. I suppose it's, 3 years since January 6th. It's not necessarily to do with them. Anyway, these justices donned the attitude of cynical partisans, repeatedly lending legitimacy to the former president's outrageous claims of immunity from criminal prosecution. To at least 5 of the conservatives, the real threat to democracy wasn't Trump's attempt to overturn the election, but the Justice Department's efforts to prosecute him for the act. These justices fear that it is Trump's prosecution for election subversion that will destabilize democracy, requiring them to read a brand new principle of presidential immunity into a constitution that guarantees nothing of the sort. They evinced virtually no concern for our ability to continue holding free and fair elections that culminate in a peaceful transfer of power. They instead offered endless solicitude for the former president who fought that transfer of power. However the court disposes of Trump versus the United States, the result will almost certainly be precisely what the former president craves: more delays, more hearings, more appeals, more of everything but justice. This was not a legitimate claim from the start, but a wild attempt by Trump's attorney to use his former role as chief executive of the United States to shield himself from the consequences of trying to turn the presidency into a dictatorship. After so much speculation that these reasonable, rational jurists would surely dispose of this ridiculous case quickly and easily, Thursday delivered a morass of bad faith hand-wringing on the right about the apparent unbearable possibility that a president might no longer be allowed to wield his powers of office in pursuit of illegal ends. Just as bad, we heard a constant minimization of January 6th for the second week in a row, as if the insurrection were ancient history, and history that has since been dramatically overblown, presumably for Democrats' partisan aims. Yes, very interesting. Also, what did this remind me of as we were on our way through? Oh, yeah, right. President no longer able to wield his powers in office in pursuit of illegal ends. But even, I'm just thinking back as others have commented, I've seen him along the way, just reminding everybody, this is the same Supreme Court that thought, well, if you forgive student loans, that's creeping authoritarianism. We're slowly descending into dictatorship if you allow the president to set pollution limitations through the EPA, or vaccine mandates in the middle of a pandemic. They're all creeping authoritarianism, slow slide into dictatorship. But absolute presidential immunity not only ought to be a concept, but always has been one, and you were just too dumb to know it. Same guys. Amazing. We got an early taste of this minimization of January 6th, earlier mentioned here in this article, in Trump versus Anderson, the Colorado case about removing Trump from the ballot. The court didn't have the stomach to discuss the violence at the Capitol in its sharply divided decision, which found for Trump. Indeed, the majority barely mentioned the events of January 6th at all when rejecting Colorado's effort to bar from the ballot an insurrectionist who tried to steal our democracy. But we let that one be because we figured Special Counsel Jack Smith would ride to the rescue. Smith has indicted Trump on election subversion charges related to January 6th, and the biggest obstacle standing between the special counsel and a trial has been the former president's outlandish claim that he has absolute immunity from criminal charges as a result of having been the president at the time. Specifically, Trump alleges that his crusade to overturn the election constituted official acts that are immune from criminal liability under a heretofore unknown constitutional principle that the chief executive is quite literally above the law. You were just pretty wrong about it. You said it didn't exist, but it did. It existed. Where? I don't see it anywhere in the text. It existed in exile. I see. So, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit held in February that the president does not have blanket or absolute immunity for all actions taken in office, including, quote, official acts performed under the guise of executing the law. For example, Trump's attempts to weaponize the DOJ against election results under the pretense of investigating fraud. The D.C. Circuit's emphatic cross-ideological decision should have been summarily affirmed by SCOTUS within days. Instead, the justices set it for arguments 2 months down the road, a bad omen, to put it mildly. Even then, many court watchers held out hope that Thursday morning's oral arguments were to be the moment for the 9 justices of the Supreme Court to finally indicate their readiness to take on Trump, Trumpism, illiberalism, and slouching fascism. It was not to be. Justice Samuel Alito captured the spirit best of arguments, or best captured the spirit of arguments when he asked gravely, what is required for the functioning of a stable democratic society? Good start. Then answered his own question. Total immunity for criminal presidents. Oh dear. Indeed, anything but immunity would, he suggested, encourage presidents to commit more crimes to stay in office. Now, if an incumbent who loses a very close, hotly contested election knows that a real possibility after leaving office is not that the president is going to be able to go off to a peaceful retirement, but that the president may be criminally prosecuted by a bitter political opponent, will that not lead us into a cycle that destabilizes the functioning of our country as a democracy? It would, until there was a Democratic president who either refused to do it to an incoming Republican challenger, or tried to and found that the Republican court forbade it for reasons that we haven't figured out yet because they've been in exile all of this time. Anyway, never mind that the president in question did not leave office peacefully. The actual one is not a hypothetical. We actually did see this happen. He did not leave office peacefully and is not sitting quietly in retirement, but is instead running for presidential office once again. No. If we want criminal presidents to leave office when they lose, we have to let them commit crimes scot-free. If ever a better articulation of the legal principle, don't make me hit you again, has been proffered at oral argument, it's hard to imagine it. Justice Sonia Sotomayor spoke to this absurdity when she responded in what could only be heard as a cri de coeur, although you could probably hear it in English too. Stable democratic society needs good faith of public officials, she said. That good faith assumes that they will follow the law. The justice noted that despite all the protections in place, a democracy can sometimes potentially fail. She concluded, in the end, if it fails completely, it's because we destroyed our democracy on our own, isn't it? But it was probably too late to make this plea, because by that point we had heard both Alito and Gorsuch opine that presidents must be protected at all costs from the whims of overzealous deep state prosecutors brandishing quote, vague criminal statutes. We heard Kavanaugh opine mindlessly on the independent counsel statute and how mean it is to presidents, reading extensively from Justice Antonin Scalia's dissent in a case arguing that independent counsels are unconstitutional. Yes, Kavanaugh worked for Ken Starr, the independent counsel. If you're clocking a trend here, it's gender. Just as was the case in Anderson, it's the women justices doing the second shift work here, both probing the thorny constitutional and criminal questions and signaling a refusal to tank democracy over abstractions and deflections, as was the case in the EMTALA arguments. It's the women who understand what it looks like to cheat death. Is the president, Sotomayor asked, immune from prosecution if he orders the military to assassinate a political rival? Yes, said John Sauer, who represented Trump, though it, quote, depends on the circumstances. It's a little bit John Yoo-ish, right? Could the president order torture in various forms? Yes, depends on the circumstances. Could the president, Justice Elena Kagan asked, order the military to stage a coup? Yes, Sauer said again, depending on the circumstances. To which Kagan tartly replied that Sauer's insistence on specifying the circumstances boiled down to, under my tests, it's an official act. But that sure sounds bad, doesn't it? Cue polite laughter in the chamber. This shameless, maximalist approach should have drawn anger from the conservative justices. Indignation, at least, that Sauer took them for such easy marks. But it turns out that he calibrated his terrible arguments just right. The cynicism on display was truly breathtaking. Alito winkingly implied to Michael Dreeben, representing Smith, that we all know that Justice Department lawyers are political hacks, right? Roberts mocked Dreeben for saying, there's no reason to worry because the prosecutor will act in good faith. The conservative justices are so in love with their own voices and so convinced of their own rectitude that they monologued about how improper it was for Dreeben to keep talking about the facts of this case, as opposed to the abstract principles at play. I'm talking about the future, Kavanaugh declared at one point to Dreeben, pitching himself not as Trump's human shield, but as a principled defender of the treasured constitutional right of all presidents to do crime. We're sure whatever rule he cooks up will equally apply to Democratic presidents, right? Kavanaugh eventually landed on the proposition that prosecutors may charge presidents only under criminal statutes that explicitly state that they can be applied to the president, which, as Sotomayor pointed out, would mean no charges everywhere, because just a tiny handful of statutes are stamped with the label can be applied to president. And by the way, one of them, I would presume, is the Presidential Records Act, from which he still claims immunity. So come on, who's subject to the Presidential Records Act, do we think? Records? I don't think so. The words bold and fearless action were repeated on a loop today as a kind of mantra of how effective presidents must be free to act quickly and decisively to save democracy from the many unanticipated threats it faces. And yet, the court, which has been asked to take bold and fearless action to deter the person who called Georgia's Secretary of State to demand that he alter the vote count and threatened to fire DOJ officials who would not help steal an election, is backing away from its own duty. The prospect of a criminal trial for a criminal president shocked and appalled 5 men. Thomas, Alito, Kavanaugh, and Gorsuch suggested that Smith's entire prosecution is unconstitutional. Meanwhile, Roberts sounded eager at times to handle the case just a hair more gracefully by cutting out its heart and preventing the jury from hearing about official acts, which lie at the center of the alleged conspiracy, of course. Justice Amy Coney Barrett was far more measured, teasing out a compromise with Dreeben that would compel the trial court to tell the jury that it would not impose criminal liability for these official acts, only private ones. But then, of course, having to figure out which ones were which, right? Remember, drawing that line would require months of hearings and appeals, pushing any trial into 2025 or beyond. The president who tried to steal the most recent election is running in the next one, which is happening in mere months. The liberal justices tried their best to make the case that justice required denying Trump's sweeping immunity claim, permitting the trial to move forward, and sorting out lingering constitutional issues afterward, as virtually all other criminal defendants must do. They got little traction. Everyone on that bench was well aware that the entire nation was listening to arguments, that the whole nation wants to understand whether Trump's refusal to concede the 2020 election was an existential threat to democracy or a lark. 5 justices sent the message loud and clear that they are far more worried about Mr. Trump's prosecution. Oh my. Something has opened up to get in my way here. Oh boy. Okay. Let's see what's going on. I wonder how that popped up. Total window switch here. All right. We were just reading 5 justices sent the message loud and clear that they are far more worried about Trump's prosecution at the hands of the deep state DOJ than about his alleged crimes, which were barely mentioned. This trial will almost certainly face yet more delays. These delays might mean that its subject could win back the presidency in the meantime, or just steal it outright, because that's okay, and render the trial moot. But the court has now signaled that nothing he did was all that serious, and that the danger he may pose is not worth reining in. The real threats, they see, are the ones Trump himself shouts from the rooftops: witch hunts and partisan Biden prosecutors. These men have picked their team. The rest hardly matters. Well, I think you knew that, but they put it very eloquently. Okay, so there you have it. There's more that we could be leaning into here. And maybe we'll finish out the segment with a more lighthearted approach to it from Alexandra Petrie, who, does she say Petrie like dishes? Because that's the name she uses on social media. Is it Petrie? Anyway, who writes this piece under the title of "A New Founding Father Time Travels to Forestall Presidential Immunity." An imaginary dialogue here between, well, you'll see. This happening allegedly at the Philadelphia Constitutional Convention in 1787, where James Madison, as we cut into the scene here, James Madison saying, "Well done, gentlemen. I believe that here we have a constitution. Let's sign this bad boy." At which point, a mysterious, disheveled new founder materializes suddenly out of thin air, looking the worse for wear. And this mysterious, disheveled new founder says, "Oh, one more thing. Put in, and just to be clear, the president can't do crimes. And if he does do crimes, he isn't absolutely immune from prosecution. Just to be safe. Just for me. I've been here the whole time, and I am from this time period. I did not just time travel from Supreme Court arguments about a former president's immunity from criminal prosecution. You can tell because I know who Governor Morris is, and that would not be something that I would know if I were from any other time." Governor Morris saying, of course, "Hey," to that, but that's all. Which is why no one knows him. Benjamin Franklin chimes in. "That sounds right, but what did you want to put in there? That the president can't do crimes? Surely that's covered. Why, you might as well add that when a president's term of office ends, he should leave." Whoa, muffled laughter happening. The new founder saying, "No, put that in too." And Franklin says, "Or the president is also bound by the country's laws." Yes, good idea. Quote, put this in here. The president should not do a coup to become king. We don't want a king. And Madison chiming back in. "I think it's hitting him over the head a little bit if we specify the president should not be a king. We do not want a king. Trust the reader. They know what we just went through, not to have a king." The new founder says, "You never know. I think this Constitution could be pretty good. Could last a long time, maybe. And then you'd feel pretty foolish if, say, 235 years from now, because you forgot to put in one little line about the president not doing crimes with impunity, we stop being a democracy." George Mason chiming in. "Democratic Republic." "Yes, sure, yes." Morris says, "You seem stressed." And Madison says, "I don't think we need to say all those obviously redundant things. Our intent is clear." The new founder now twitching. "I love that optimism." Madison, "It's just, I worked really hard on this. And all of what you said feels like it's implied in there already. What moron, what utter nincompoop would think, oh, the president should get to do a coup if he wants? New Founder says, let's just say it, just in case. I just think we should say everything. Don't add it later. Say it in the text. George Mason, of course, saying, this is what I'm always saying. If you're really serious about a right, put it in the main text. Don't just tack it on like some afterthought. If you want people to be able to carry semi-automatic weapons into a coffee shop for fun, put it in the big part. And then the New Founder says, wait, you envisioned that? Envisioned what? Now George Washington chimes in, what a low opinion of future citizens you seem to have. Who could possibly argue that the president would use his office to suborn the republic? The New Founder answers, hypothetically, this might be a great document that works for 235 years with steady improvements being made all the time, and then some utter ghoul might go before the Supreme Court and, put in an ethics code for them and term limits. And Madison answers, that seems unnecessary, and argue that it had worked fine for 235 years, because it had worked fine for 235 years, we should explicitly dismantle the guardrails that have been holding everything in place for so long. Well, why, Franklin asks, would that be? That would be like tossing your umbrella aside because no rain was getting on your head so long as you stood under it. Thanks. Good quote there. Morris saying, why, that would be like if someone devised a miraculous vaccine that could prevent measles, and everyone took it, and it prevented them from getting measles. And then they said, no need for vaccines. Measles is gone. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I think, responsible for the umbrella quote, right? Mason then summing the whole thing, said, why, that would be like getting rid of child labor laws because there were currently no children working. You get the idea here as the mysterious, disheveled New Founder begins to sob. All these things, of course, being dismantled in the last couple of years, or maybe even just this one single year, by our current Supreme Court. Wow. Okay. Well, coming up on our top of the hour break here, and here comes the music. So, won't be anything else to fit in before we move on, but maybe we can shift gears a little bit. There's definitely some other stories and there's probably other angles that I'll discover on my way through what's in pocket. But, got to catch up on some of these other stories. I got at least one that I know has to be read before the weekend, or else you won't look cool at weekend party chatter. So, we'll be right back with that. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. We got another hour to go here, and lots more to fit in. When I said there was a story that had to be read to you or discussed with you, this was something that I think Greg mentioned it yesterday. And we didn't read the story, but it was alluded to and it was much passed around and discussed yesterday. And I think Greg may have read some of the resulting commentary. But I feel like we got to go back to this one and read it through just so that we're all on the same page here. This is the Politico piece, Politico magazine piece about what the title says, the petty feud between the New York Times and the White House. Greg definitely alluded to this. Biden's people think they're, quote, entitled, I guess, according to the people of the Times. And the Times says they're not being realistic. But this is rather incredible, and everybody had a lot to say about this one. So let's roll through it and say some of our own things about it as well. Eli Stokols is the author of this piece. Again, much talked about. He's the White House correspondent for Politico and co-author of West Wing Playbook. He wants you to know, I guess, in the byline up top here. When news broke one Saturday night in March of 2023 that President Joe Biden's nominee to lead the Federal Aviation Administration was withdrawing, Mark Walker was the reporter on duty in the New York Times Washington bureau. Assigned to write up the news, Walker asked the White House for a comment just before midnight. Assistant Press Secretary Abdullah Hassan was still up and emailed a quote, blaming the withdrawal on a barrage of unfounded Republican attacks. After going through edits, Walker's 502-word story was posted on the Times' website in the wee hours of Sunday morning. Then all hell broke loose. Oh, okay. Why? Hassan, who has since left the White House, had offered the quote to Walker on background, sourced to, quote, an administration official. Walker, not a member of the Times' White House team, was unfamiliar with the protocol and had made an unintended mistake and attributed the quote to Hassan, which is kind of amazing. I know, like, okay, I guess that's supposed to be the excuse. He's not a member of the usual White House reporting team, but I mean, on background means the same thing everywhere, doesn't it? I mean, I'm not a reporter, and I have a pretty good idea of what that means. I don't know about necessarily all the nuance, but on background means, yeah, not for named attribution. Okay, well, he didn't, whatever. A mistake was made. When officials in the press shop called him on Sunday morning about the mistake, they asked to speak with White House editor Elizabeth Kennedy. Okay, but the number that he gave them, I guess Walker gave them, was the cell phone of Elizabeth Buemiller, the Times' Washington bureau chief. Not the White House editor, but the Washington bureau chief. Okay. Buemiller, who was away from Washington visiting family, received a call from Emily Simons, S-I-M-O-N, just one M. Simons, a White House deputy press secretary, who had actually written the statement. According to three people familiar with the conversation, Simons asked that Hassan's name be removed and the quote attributed to a nameless official. Buemiller, who expressed dismay that the issue had escalated to her level, was reluctant to alter a story that had already been online for over 12 hours. I can understand that, but yeah, this sensitivity about, well, why did you call me? And I'm so indignant. And that too was a mistake, but there's mistakes all over the place here. But so what? You're the Washington bureau chief. Why not? Why can't the White House call you about those things? Well, anyway, both parties later told colleagues that the call ended on a sour note. Two Times staffers recalled Buemiller grumbling, as she occasionally does, about how she'd been spoken to. I see. Aides in the press shop recalled hearing that the bureau chief had been surprisingly defensive, and that when Simons tried to bring up another concern with Walker's story, Buemiller just hung up. The following day, Principal Deputy Press Secretary Olivia Dalton emailed Buemiller asking the Times to reaffirm its commitment to abide by the administration's rules about information given on background. For Dalton, Simons, and others, it was about ensuring fairness with embargoed information so that all news organizations could be on a level playing field. But the Times' bureau chief never replied. In response, the White House removed all Times reporters from its Tier 1 email list for background information about various briefings and other materials, a situation that wasn't resolved for 11 months. Right? Essentially, the White House said, well, if you can't reconfirm to me that you're going to play by the rules of information given on background, well, I'm going to give information on background to this list of organizations that does abide by the rules, and not you. And the New York Times, of course, being the fact that they are the New York Times, was highly insulted by this. The seemingly minor incident over sourcing might not have escalated or triggered such emotional responses on both sides if not for tensions between the White House and the Times that had been bubbling beneath the surface for at least the last 5 years. Biden's closest aides had come to see the Times as arrogant, intent on setting its own rules and unwilling to give Biden his due. Inside the paper's D.C. bureau, the punitive response seemed to typify a press operation that was overly sensitive and determined to control coverage of the president. According to interviews with 24 people on both sides who were granted anonymity to discuss a sensitive subject, did they actually honor the anonymity? I guess they did. What do you know? The relationship between the Democratic president and the country's newspaper of record, for years the epitome of a liberal press in the eyes of conservatives, remains remarkably tense, beset by misunderstandings, grudges, and a general lack of trust. Complaints that were long kept private are even spilling into public view, with campaign aides in Wilmington going further than their colleagues in the White House and routinely blasting the paper's coverage in emails, posts on social media, and memos. Although the president's communications team bristles at coverage from dozens of outlets, the frustration and obsession with the Times is unique, reflecting the resentment of a president with a working-class sense of himself and his team toward a news organization catering to an elite audience, and a deep desire for its affirmation of their work. On the other side, the newspaper carries its own singular obsession with the president, aggrieved over his refusal to give the paper a sit-down interview that publisher A.G. Sulzberger and other top editors believe to be its birthright. The president's press flacks might bemoan what they see as the entitlement of Times staffers, but they themselves put the newspaper on the highest of pedestals given its history, stature, and unparalleled reach. And yet, they see the Times falling short in a make-or-break moment for American democracy, stubbornly refusing to adjust its coverage as it strives for the appearance of impartial neutrality, often blurring the asymmetries between former President Donald Trump and Biden when it comes to their perceived flaws and vastly different commitments to democratic principles. Democrats believe in the importance of a free press in upholding our democracy, and the New York Times was for generations an important standard bearer for the Fourth Estate, said Kate Berner, who worked on Biden's 2020 campaign and then as Deputy White House Communications Director before departing last year. The frustration with the Times is sometimes so intense because the Times is failing at its important responsibility. Biden aides largely view the election as an existential choice for the country, high stakes that they believe justify tougher tactics toward the Times and the press as a whole. Some Times reporters have found themselves cut off by sources after publishing pieces that the Bidens, and top aides didn't like. Columnist Maureen Dowd, for example, complained to colleagues that she stopped hearing from the White House officials after a column on Hunter Biden. Okay. For many Times veterans, such actions suggest that the Trump era has warped many Democrats' expectations of journalists. So they actually were worried that Democrats might want from the paper or all papers exactly what Trump demanded the whole time. Oh no. Why didn't they react more strongly when Trump demanded it? They're not being realistic about what we do for a living, Buehmiller told me. You can be a force for democracy, liberal democracy. You don't have to be a force for the Biden White House. Having been in politics for some 50 years, Biden has long dealt with reporters and editors from the Times, and for the most part cordially. But frustrations began to mount early in 2019 as Biden launched his third run for the White House in a crowded Democratic primary field. Times reporters were annoyed not to have been invited to Biden's first public appearance after announcing his candidacy. An informal stop at a Wilmington pizzeria that two other reporters were tipped off about. But aides to Biden, who tended to trust his generational contemporaries at the Times, columnists and other journalists he'd gotten comfortable with over the years, said they didn't know anyone on the politics team well. Unlike some outlets, the Times just never invested in a reporter who really knew and understood Biden and his appeal, said one former campaign staffer, and the coverage reflected that. It's very interesting because, of course, whenever there's a radical wackadoodle Republican running for president, whether Trump or anybody else, the Times and other outlets like them always say that they're making some sort of special hire to get inside the heads of these people. I mean, we just watched, was it CNN, NBC? Who was it that just thought to try to hire Ronna Romney McDaniel and then got finally forced out of it? But we gotta hire one of these criminals in order to get inside the criminal heads that are running for presidents again. But no. Not the New York Times, not with the guy who actually became president. In the early months of the Democratic primary, the Times was responding to pressures of its own. Still in the throes of covering the Trump presidency, the institution had become acutely self-conscious about criticism that it was out of touch with much of the country. It wasn't. Or at least not on the idea that maybe Trump was dangerous, but okay. At the same time, Editor-in-Chief Dean Baquet, is that right, how he says his name? Who knows? I've heard it pronounced a number of times, but I've just not paid attention. And then managing editor Joe Kahn were stung by former editor Jill Abramson's criticism of how the narcissistic Times had missed the rise of Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in 2018. That's a good point. That's a hometown thing. According to 4 Times veterans, as Democratic presidential hopefuls began debating, coverage focused heavily on the policy debates among more progressive candidates, debates Biden largely wasn't involved in. While Massachusetts Senator, that's not so bad. While Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren was gaining ground in early polls and enjoying positive early coverage, stories about Biden in the Times frequently depicted him as a relic, out of step with younger, more liberal primary voters, and, following defeats in the early contests, poorly organized. Although it had nothing to do with the newsroom, the opinion page's double endorsement of Warren and Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota, neither of whom won a single primary or caucus, helped cement Biden world's view that the Times was out of touch with the broader electorate, an electorate personified by the Times security guard who gushed over Biden in the Times elevator as he was headed up for his interview with the editorial board. In a subtle tweak aimed at the Times, Biden's campaign invited that security guard to formally nominate him at the DNC months later. Wow, that is something. Maybe they shouldn't have done that. All right, well, anyway, it's nice for her, but okay. Biden aides, who spent months privately imploring the paper's editors and reporters not to write him off too early in the cycle, still hold a grudge under the belief that the paper was institutionally aligned toward Warren and progressives, which is not a bad thing, if it were true, but I don't know that it is. And look, the Times editor, one senior Times editor, told me it's just not true. So there you go. Biden, the editor continued, wasn't involved in a lot of the debates about Medicare for all that dominated the early months of the race. And that's a good point, I think. And while a lot of campaigns were offering access to the candidate, Biden was not. That played out in the coverage. I can buy that. But it was the paper's willingness to legitimize rumors swirling around Hunter Biden's past business dealings in Ukraine that left top campaign officials most incensed. And that's harder to buy. In a letter to Baquet in October of 2019, Deputy Campaign Manager Kate Bedingfield blasted the Times for a story by reporter Ken Vogel and freelancer Yulia Mendel focused on allegations by Rudy Giuliani and other Trump allies that Joe Biden took actions toward Ukraine as vice president in order to boost his son Hunter Biden's business interests there. The paper's reporting, the letter claimed, legitimized a debunked conspiracy theory that had been, to that point, relegated to the likes of Breitbart, Russian propaganda, and regular Hannity guest John Solomon. Complaints about the paper's Hunter Biden coverage dominated the late 2019 meeting at campaign headquarters in Philadelphia, where Bedingfield and other senior Biden operatives met with Times politics editor Patrick Healy and a few reporters to discuss the paper's coverage. Although the meeting was not especially confrontational, both sides mostly talked past one another, according to people in both camps familiar with the conversation. While Healy and the Times reporters made clear that they took Biden seriously as a candidate and potential nominee, they defended coverage of the allegations swirling around his son and ultimately made little headway in convincing campaign aides to make Biden more available. It was helpful to hear what was on their minds, one Times staffer familiar with the meeting said, but in some ways they don't shape and control their narrative the way they could if they were more engaged, which they really shouldn't be able to do, but is a weird admission for you to make, but there you go. But yes, I mean, and this is a good point too, and this is, I think, really central to the whole thing, is that the New York Times, just as they legitimized the Clinton cash claims that Steve K.G. Bannon was making in his stupid book in 2016, prior to the 2016 campaign, They, too, were the chief motivator in, quote-unquote, legitimizing these accusations about Hunter Biden and Joe Biden in Ukraine. And they could have been, stomped out and marginalized right there and then, or at least would have survived only as Republican conspiracy theory. But they made this mistake. Anyway, although the newspaper, like most mainstream outlets with a heavy White House presence, devoted pages of coverage to the president's early legislative successes, its unrelenting focus on Biden's advanced age and his low numbers in the New York Times approval poll have frustrated the president and top aides to no end. Beyond that, they bemoan the newspaper's penchant for sweepy comparisons, analytical reporter memos, referred to in the Biden press shop as opinion pieces or diary entries, and story frames that seem consistently skeptical. The Times chief White House correspondent, Peter Baker, whose stories about Biden's age have regularly strummed a particularly sensitive nerve, told me that the administration's frustrations over his and his colleagues' coverage wasn't all that unique. Every White House I've covered complains about our coverage. It comes with the territory, he said. It's probably true. But because of Trump, there's this new assumption that the New York Times and other media are supposed to put their thumb on the scale and take sides, and we don't do that. Privately, other Times reporters who have engaged with the Biden White House and campaign view the frustration with the paper as a misguided effort to control its coverage. Beyond that, they believe writing about Trump with the stronger language Biden aides seem to want would likely do more to affect the newspaper's brand and the public's trust in it than Trump's. The newspaper's brand and the public's trust than Trump's. We haven't been tough enough on Trump. I mean, give me a break, Buehmiller responded when I asked about that oft-heard complaint. Have they read our coverage? I don't have to go through all the things we've covered on Trump, so we just do our jobs. Still, the White House and campaign officials most incensed by the Times' coverage often trace their outrage back to Trump, who they see as a true threat to American democracy and, by extension, a free press. No current White House staffers were willing to speak publicly to voice their complaints, but those willing to talk on background, without their names being used, told me they viewed the matter as bigger than their own or even Biden's self-interest, expressing aggravation over the Times' determination to maintain its neutral voice of God approach to an election that, in their view, is a matter of democracy's survival. We do not comment on the specifics of our private discussions with reporters and editors, said Deputy Press Secretary Andrew Bates in response to my request for comment from the White House. But as a White House that believes deeply in the role of the free press in American democracy, we would note that a mutually honest, fact-based, respectful back and forth is a cornerstone of any healthy relationship between a media outlet and an administration. We have that kind of dialogue with the New York Times and many other media organizations. The Times' desire for a sit-down interview with Biden by the newspaper's White House team is no secret around the West Wing or within the D.C. Bureau. Getting the president on record with the paper of record is a top priority for publisher A.G. Sulzberger, so much so that last May, when Vice President Kamala Harris arrived at the newspaper's Midtown headquarters for an off-the-record meeting with around 40 Times journalists, Sulzberger devoted several minutes to asking her why Biden was still refusing to grant the paper, or any major newspaper, an interview. Harris, according to 3 people in the room that day, suggested that he contact the White House press office and later grumbled to aides about the back and forth being a waste of the allotted time, which it was. A few months later, with the Times' White House team still banned from the embargoed list and frustrations on both sides mounting, senior administration officials invited executive editor Joe Kahn, managing editor Carolyn Ryan, and Buehmiller to the White House. Although there was some discussion inside the Times of whether Kahn should respond to a summons to Washington from anyone besides the president himself, he decided to go, largely to make the case for Biden to do an interview. Oh, thanks. Only the White House. The meeting with senior advisor Anita Dunn and communications director Ben LeBolt was not unlike many held from time to time with executives from other newspapers and TV networks, an exchange of views about the outlet's coverage, a pitch for more access, and an interview. Dunn and LeBolt went through a list of complaints. The unrelenting focus on polls and age. Reporters not giving the White House much time to respond to stories prior to publication. The Times brass listened and sought to explain the principles guiding its coverage. The meeting, according to 3 people on both sides familiar with the conversation, was not especially contentious. One sign of a slight thaw in relations came weeks later when the White House invited Khan and his wife to attend a state dinner for the Australian Prime Minister in October. But the pleas for an interview have gone nowhere. As Sulzberger often tells colleagues, and he and Khan have stressed in private conversations with the administration, every modern president since Franklin Delano Roosevelt has done an interview with the Times. That, however, is an argument deemed uncompelling by Biden aides, and one that, to some White House officials, smacks of entitlement. Plus, Biden has sat for interviews with only 2 print reporters in more than 3 years, Josh Boak of the Associated Press and Evan Osnos of The New Yorker, who earned Biden's trust during a lengthy interview during the 2020 campaign that he turned into a book. He has, of course, been eager to engage with columnists he knows and trusts, 2 of whom happen to work at the Times. In Sulzberger's view, according to 2 people familiar with his private comments on the subject, only an interview with a paper like the Times can verify that the 81-year-old Biden is still fit to hold the presidency. Oh, really? Beyond that, he has voiced concerns that Biden doing so few expansive interviews with experienced reporters could set a dangerous precedent for future administrations, according to a third person familiar with the publisher's thinking. Sulzberger himself was part of a group from the Times that sat down with Trump, who gave the paper several interviews despite his rantings about its coverage. If Trump could do it, Sulzberger believes, so can Biden. We can, but what if he just doesn't want to? Anyway, all these Biden people think that the problem is Peter Baker or whatever reporter they're mad at that day, one Times journalist said. It's AG. He's the one who's pissed that Biden hasn't done any interviews and quietly encourages all the tough reporting on his age. That's interesting. After this story was published, the Times offered an additional statement on its push for an interview. The notion that any line of coverage has been ordered up or encouraged in retaliation for declining an interview or any other reason is outrageous and untrue, said Charlie Statlander, a spokesman for the Times, who said the paper will continue to cover Biden fully and fairly, regardless of whether he gives the paper an interview. He also emphasized that Sulzberger has repeatedly urged the White House to have the president sit down with the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Reuters, CNN, and other major independent news organizations that millions of Americans rely on to understand their government. When describing their grievances with the Times, almost every Biden administration and campaign official uses the word entitled to characterize the institution writ large, and several of the individuals within the newsroom, where Timesian is an adjective routinely deployed without irony. Those officials described reporters who refused to correct minor errors or mischaracterizations in stories, or those who haven't been willing to engage with anyone besides the most senior administration officials. That said, many White House officials maintain productive working relationships with most of the Times reporters who cover the beat. Buehmiller and other Times White House reporters note that it's always been the newspaper's prerogative to determine what to cover and how. This is pretty much par for the course, Buehmiller said. No White House has ever been happy with our coverage, and I don't see why they should be. Our job is to hold power to account. Even if some of the hard feelings towards the Times have eased somewhat with time, several White House reporters, after verbally reiterating their willingness to abide by the administration's embargo rules, were added back to the Tier 1 list earlier this year. Officials in the Biden press shop remain frustrated that the coverage hasn't changed. The paper continues to serve up fodder for the New York Times PitchBot account on Twitter, which has amassed a large following, including almost the entire Biden press shop, by the way, by mocking the paper's perceived negativity toward the president and its often euphemistic-laden soft focus coverage of Trump. I think we're all familiar with that. Bates, the deputy press secretary, has developed an online correspondence with the operator of the PitchBot account and occasionally shared material for potential posts. 2 people familiar with the press shop said. During last year's White House Correspondents' Dinner, Biden joked about confusing the Times' coverage of his age with PitchBot's tweets. I love that guy, Biden said of PitchBot before a subtle parting shot at the Times on a frequency only Times staffers might hear. I should do an interview with him. That's a good one. Aides in the White House press office and on the president's campaign pointed to two recent examples of articles by the Times that presented Biden and Trump side by side, emphasizing broad similarities and obscuring the proportional differences. One piece by Michael Shear cast both Biden and Trump as restricting the information the public has about their physical health. Another in the paper's On Politics newsletter by the newly hired Jess Bidgood reacted to Arizona's reinstatement of a Civil War-era law outlawing abortion. I better check on the music here. Oh, yeah, we're way behind on that one. But the Civil War-era law outlawing abortion by framing Biden and Trump as two imperfect messengers on the issue. A gross journalistic injustice, campaign officials said, given Trump's outsized role in appointing the Supreme Court justices who overturned Roe v. Wade. True enough, and we'll be right back. Hi, everybody. It's me, David Waldman. Yes, the same guy who interrupts you all the time. Interrupting you one more time just to tell you again, another reminder that your contributions are what keep this show on the air, and Patreon.com, Patreon.com, is still among the easiest ways to make the sustaining subscription donations that keep us afloat. Are you ready for the pep talk about how our Patreon campaign is still going strong and growing? Well, too bad. Yeah, the plain fact is we actually are headed in the wrong direction, and whereas we once had about 175 monthly patrons, we're now actually down below 150. Time to recruit some more. Not exactly the kind of news I wanted to share, but there it is. For those of you in a position to support the show, Patreon.com does make it easy to make those secure, recurring monthly contributions to do so. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. We've been through a lot together. The worst of the pandemic, we hope. The worst of the insurrection, we hope. So go ahead and treat yourself. You don't need an excuse. Give yourself the gift of a little something you enjoy in life. Support the show. And of course, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running on those options too. So thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We couldn't, or at least shouldn't, do it without you. Hope you'll be on board soon too. Thanks for all your support. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Whew, okay, let's see. Let's continue on toward the end. We're almost at the end of this lengthy New York Times piece, and we need about 15 more hours to catch you up on all the other things that I wanted to share with you. But let's finish this one here. Okay, I'm in the wrong Washington or New York Times story here. I got to get back to Politico. I went back thinking, all right, we'll finish about the New York Times. I went to the page that had the Times logo on it, but we were reading Politico. Remember this one? Okay. Yes, so we left off by pointing out that they were also kind of annoyed by the coverage of the Arizona reinstatement of the Civil War era outlawing abortion by saying, well, they're both pretty much the same. Trump and Biden are both imperfect messengers on the issue. Well, TJ Ducklow, a senior advisor on Biden's campaign, blasted Shear's story as part of an ongoing pattern of frustrating coverage by the Times. With limited exceptions, he wrote in a Twitter post, the Times continues to fail the American people in covering the most important election for democracy in 150 plus years. It was not the first time Biden's campaign team publicly went after the Times in a way that the White House, for all its irritation, has not. In February, the campaign blasted the Times and other news organizations for focusing more on the president's age than Trump's comment encouraging Russia to do whatever the hell you want to any NATO country not meeting defense spending benchmarks. If you read the New York Times this weekend, you might have missed, or if you read the New York Times, you might have missed it buried behind 5 separate opinion pieces about how the president is 81 years old. Something that has been true since his birthday in November, and 0 on this topic, the surrender to Russia. Ducklow wrote, I would add, in case you forgot what this topic was. Earlier this year, Ducklow, Communications Director Michael Tyler, and other senior campaign aides met privately in Wilmington with groups of reporters from a number of organizations covering Biden, including Politico, which is printing this article, of course, almost all of whom got dressed down for coverage that was seen as too fixated on the president's age or other liabilities, especially compared to the treatment of Trump. But when Semaphore wrote about the off-the-record meetings, only the meetings with the Times was described as not having been substantive or productive. Times reporters believe the leak had to have come from the campaign, the only ones who'd have had knowledge of all the meetings, and it led to conversations on the politics staff about whether to even engage with Wilmington in an off-the-record capacity. But campaign aides are certain the leak came from the Times side. We had done over a dozen of these meetings leading up to the Times meeting and only got a press inquiry about the meetings less than 48 hours after the Times meeting, senior campaign officials told me, noting that Semaphore's Max Tunney quoted back to us the exact language that had been used by Times reporters in the meeting 2 days earlier. The campaign's outward turn toward press criticism is something of a new phenomenon, mirroring the response of the very online left in the age of Trump. But the Times is bearing the brunt of it, and many who've given their careers to the institution are perplexed by the shift. Criticizing our stories in their press releases, Buehmiller said, I just don't know what it gets them. Well, it's not getting them anything but the Times, that's sure. But, I don't know, seemed like a point well taken across most of the online sphere, if that's even a thing. I mean, that's the online, whatever. But lots of commentary on it and lots of nodding, knowingly and understandingly, acknowledging this weird predilection at the New York Times. Okay. So there are many other things that I wanted to share with you, and I can't decide what to use our time on here. There's more actually interesting stuff here about the Supreme Court and the immunity case, but I mean, come on at this point. But this has actually been sitting here for, well, actually not that long. I guess I've put a whole lot of articles away lately in Pocket, so it makes it seem like it was buried deep in the archives. But this was from April 24th, a guest essay in the opinion section by Melissa Murray and Andrew Weissman. Weissman you may recognize, but Murray is his co-author on the book, The Trump Indictments, the Historic Charging Documents with Commentary. And do I really? All right. I mean, we've been covering the topic ad nauseum, and there's so many other things to share with you. But still, this one is important and has a different angle. The Supreme Court has already botched the Trump immunity case, even before it had been heard. Why? How so? Well, some of it you probably guessed. The Supreme Court's decision to hear oral arguments in the immunity appeal case on Thursday may appear to advance the rule of law. I don't think so, but that was generous of them. After all, few, if anyone, think that the majority of the court will conclude that a former president is completely immune, anyway, from federal criminal liability. But the court's decision to review the immunity case actually undermines core democratic values. That's not unusual. It's not that we haven't heard that before. The Supreme Court often has an institutional interest in cases of presidential power. But the court's insistence on putting its own stamp on this case, despite the widespread assumption that it will not change the application of immunity to this case, and the sluggish pace chosen to hear it, means that it will have needlessly delayed legal accountability for no justifiable reason. Even if the Supreme Court eventually does affirm that no person, not even a president, is above the law and immune from criminal liability, its actions will not amount to a victory for the rule of law and may be corrosive to the democratic values for which the United States should be known. That is because the court's delay may have stripped citizens of the criminal justice system's most effective mechanism for determining disputed facts, a trial before a judge and a jury where the law and the facts can be weighed and resolved. It is in this forum, and the resolution it provides, that Mr. Trump seeks at all costs to avoid. It is this forum, not in this forum. But it is not surprising that he loudly proclaims his innocence in the court of public opinion. What is surprising is that the nation's highest court has interjected itself in a way that facilitates his efforts to avoid a legal reckoning. That, too, not new, but just a slightly different angle on what he hopes to gain by delay. And a reminder that this is an actual a play here, that, you know, delaying things is supposed to give him a certain outcome. He's hoping to shape the law by refusing to participate in its adjudication, which is amazing. Looking at the experience of other countries is instructive. In Brazil, the former president, Jair Bolsonaro, after baselessly claiming fraud before an election, was successfully prosecuted, in a court and barred from running for office for years. In France, the former president Jacques Chirac was successfully prosecuted for illegal diversion of public funds during his time as mayor of Paris. Likewise, Argentina, Italy, Japan, and South Korea have relied on the courts to hold corrupt leaders to account for their misconduct. Because the courts have been such crucial scaffolding for democracy, leaders with authoritarian impulses often seek to undermine judicial authority and defang the courts to advance their interests. As the national security and governance writer Rachel Kleinfeld has pointed out, democracies have been falling all over the world in recent years. The decline has largely occurred at the hands of elected leaders who use their popularity to ride roughshod over their country's institutions, destroying oversight by 1,000 cuts. Consider India, Bolivia, Hungary, and Venezuela, where the erosion of judicial independence of the courts has been accompanied by a rise in all-consuming power for an individual leader. I don't know whether they get around to it, of course, but recall that prior to October 7th, the biggest news out of Israel was national protest, nationwide protest against what? Undermining the authority of the judiciary in Israel. Within our constitutional system, the U.S. Supreme Court can still act effectively and quickly to preserve the judiciary's role in a constitutional democracy. If the court is truly concerned about the rule of law and ensuring that these disputed facts are resolved in a trial, it could issue a ruling quickly after the oral argument. It would then fall to Special Counsel Jack Smith and Judge Chutkan to ensure that this case gets to a jury. Obviously, fidelity to due process and careful attention to the rights of the accused are critical. To get to a trial and avoid any further potential delay, Smith may decide to limit the government's case to its bare essentials, what is often called the slim to win strategy. And Judge Chutkan has already warned Mr. Trump that his pretrial unruly statements with respect to witnesses and others may result in her moving up the start of the trial to protect judicial process. Before Election Day 2024, if at all possible, voters should know if the facts of a case establish that one of the candidates engaged in an elaborate election interference scheme in 2020. But will it? Justice Juan Merchan, who's overseeing the Manhattan criminal trial, and the New York appellate courts offer an instructive model of fair and expeditious case management. In less than a week, Justice Merchan has seated a jury, and he and many appellate judges have quickly ruled on Trump's efforts to thwart the start of that trial. If the Supreme Court resolves the immunity question quickly, allowing the federal election interference case to proceed, Judge Chutkan's case management likewise will be pivotal in dealing with the intricacies of jury selection in a high-profile case and effectively distinguishing between frivolous and meritorious defense arguments that would prolong the trial timeline. These options may seem like a long shot, but they are the ones that remain. Courts are supposed to serve as a neutral forum for the determination of facts and the adjudication of law. And as examples in other countries illustrate, they can be a crucial bulwark for the rule of law in precarious times. Politics and law are often seen as separate institutions. They're not. In fact, though, they regularly interact within our constitutional system as checks and balances, unless, as is the case here, the court takes on an overbearing role. The Supreme Court's review of the immunity issue delays indefinitely a jury trial of Trump's role in obstructing the peaceful transfer of power, and therefore risks transforming our nation into a Potemkin village of democracy that bears the surface trappings of legal institutions, but without actual checks on the executive branch of government. True enough, worth adding, I think, to the mix here. And let's see, that actually reminds me of something I'm going to have to scroll a little further down to try and pick up. Does this bear as much relation to this as I thought? Just sort of interesting in the sense that it reminds me of manipulation of the court and courtroom process that might be worth taking a look at here. Matt Cohen, writing at the Democracy docket on April 19th. Let's see if we can make it bear relation here. How a right-wing legal group uses the courts to spread election disinformation. It's interesting. It's a different game here, but something seems similar in the approach here. Using the American tolerance for delay in the name of due process and using institutions that we're used to turning to for objective truth to our disadvantage. And let's see what they're talking about here, if we can run through this one quickly. On November 3rd, 2021, a complaint filed against Michigan Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson, a Democrat, made some disturbing allegations. The Great Lakes state was not conducting adequate maintenance of its voters, and as a result, tens of thousands of dead Michigan residents were still registered to vote. Totally different venue, totally different ball game. But again, use of the forum of the judiciary as the place to adjudicate truth, and where you're supposed to take things seriously if they're written down in the form of a lawsuit, even if they are garbage to begin with. Slight shift, but similar tactics, I think, given how ridiculous everyone thought the Trump position going into yesterday's argument before the Supreme Court actually was. Now, back to this. The lawsuit filed by the Public Interest Legal Foundation, PILF, and you never want anything that ends in ILF, but online parlance has made that dangerous. But PILF, Public Interest Legal Foundation, accused Michigan of violating the Federal National Voter Registration Act, or NVRA, motor voter, if you remember it that way, by not updating its voter registration record to effectively remove dead voters. Sounds bad, right? According to PILF's analysis, the state's voter rolls, 23,663 registered voters had been dead for 5 years or more, while 17,479 had been dead for at least 10 years, and nearly 4,000 had been dead for at least 20 years. Sounds awful. It was a shocking accusation, one that triggered months of investigation to figure out how this happened. There was only one problem. It wasn't true. Oh no, months of investigation wasted. Darn. Why? On March 1st, 2024, a federal judge tossed out the lawsuit, writing that after conducting more than 9 months of discovery into the many facets of Michigan's program for the removal of deceased registrants, the record demonstrates that deceased voters are removed from Michigan's voter rolls on a regular and ongoing basis. The order went on to applaud the merits of the state's maintenance of its voter rolls, specifying how it canceled between 400,000 and 450,000 deceased voters between 2019 and March of 2023. In other words, all the things that you assumed were really going on behind the scenes to maintain the voter rolls cleanly were in fact going on. But 9 months of discovery and headline after headline generated by a total garbage lawsuit driven entirely by Republican fantasy and conspiracy theory, right? In a statement released after the judge's order, Benson praised Michigan's Bureau of Elections for its diligence in keeping the state's voter registration records accurate. She also delivered a disturbing warning to voters. This is 2024. Voters should expect more attempts to fool them about our elections to follow this failed effort, Benson wrote, and they should know we will continue to respond to those attacks with truth, facts, and data to give all citizens confidence in every valid vote, and that only valid votes will be counted in every election. Meanwhile, all their time is being consumed debunking stupid conspiracy lawsuits and stupid conspiracy theories. How are they supposed to do the regular work? But that's the problem. These groups know that they can divert time, attention, and resources and cause frustration among the professionals who do this and do it very well by continuing to harass them with lawsuits. That's the point of this article. Over the past few election cycles, there's been a steady stream of right-wing groups launching a full frontal legal assault on voting rights. But PILF is one of the most prolific and nefarious. Since its founding in 2012, the conservative legal group has become synonymous with suing state and local governments to purge registered voters from their election rolls, barring non-citizens from voting, which already happens, and defending voter suppression laws. But the basis for its legal arguments, like in the Michigan lawsuit, typically peddle disinformation about mass election fraud. And while PILF's grand claims of mass voter fraud get dismissed when no evidence turns up, the group succeeds in promoting disinformation in the courts and in the media, sowing doubt in the election process, right? You got a headline, group sues the state for, failing to stop massive dead voter election fraud. There's the headline. It's not until 9 months later that the answer is, oh yeah, that never actually happened. And how big is that headline? Anyway, that of course is by design. Behind PILF's attack on voting rights is a well-funded conservative legal machine that gets most of its money from a network of right-wing dark money groups with a rich history of trying to suppress the right to vote. PILF was, again, founded in 2012 as the Act Right Legal Foundation, a nonprofit law firm with the stated mission to defend the free exercise of religious belief, First Amendment rights of free speech and association. I'm sure they're rushing to the campuses right now. Voting rights, property rights, and other constitutional rights of due process and equal protection, as they pertain to Republicans, of course. According to its first tax filing, which, of course, should mean that they get no nonprofit status because they're so outrageously partisan, but whatever. Since then, however, the group has narrowed its focus to primarily litigating against voting rights and promoting election integrity, according to its most recent tax filing, anyway. And PILF is able to fund such lawsuits through a myriad of right-wing dark money groups that annually contribute millions of dollars to the group. According to its non-profit tax filings over the years, PILF has received a bulk of its funding from right-wing groups like the Leonard Leo Tide 85 Fund. Not familiar myself, but we should look it up. It's linked here. The Linda and Harry Bradley Foundation. With them, I am familiar. And Donors Trust, the Koch brothers affiliated group that's known as the dark money ATM of the conservative movement. The group's leadership consists of a who's who of right-wing figures and personalities known for peddling election conspiracy theories and disinformation. J. Christian Adams has served as PILF's president since 2015 and is a close ally of former President Donald Trump, who appointed him to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, of all things, according to research compiled by Accountable.us. In 2016, Adams authored a conspiracy-riddled article claiming that the voting process is being, quote, hacked by the left, unbelievably enough, and that, among other baseless claims, tens of thousands of non-citizens are on American voter rolls, if not more, who are voting in elections. They are not. Adams is a prominent 2020 election denier as well, who's repeatedly made false claims about the presidential election. Serving alongside Adams at the top of PILF is attorney Cleta Mitchell, the organization's chairwoman, who played a prominent role in advising Trump in his efforts to overturn the 2020 election. Mitchell, of course, was part of the infamous phone call Trump made to Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger in 2020, asking him to find 11,780 votes to help him win the election. Fake win the election in Georgia. I would say fake. The House committee investigating the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol subpoenaed Mitchell for her role in instigating the insurrection. She eluded an indictment in the criminal prosecution against Trump and his campaign and legal team in Georgia for trying to steal the election, but remains one of the most vocal election deniers in the conservative movement. And a name from way, way back, if you've been listening forever or reading our stuff forever, Hans von Spakovsky, PILF's director and board member since 2014, is also one of the most prominent right-wing voices in promoting election disinformation and pushing voter suppression measures. He's promoted a number of 2020 election conspiracies, but notably he sat on a board of a social welfare organization, allegedly, that spread a QAnon-adjacent conspiracy theory alleging that Italian military satellites, you remember this one, were used to steal the election for President Joe Biden. Finally, there's John Eastman, the disgraced former Trump lawyer who was recently recommended to be disbarred by a California judge for his role in plotting to overthrow the 2020 election. Eastman has been involved with PILF since it started and is listed as a director on its tax filings. How are they tax exempt, everyone? Eastman's disbarment recommendation stems from 2 memos that he sent after the 2020 election that outlined a scenario in which Trump could stay in power. He could not, of course. Eastman concocted the plan to have former Vice President Mike Pence throw out electoral votes for Biden in key states and instead find electors to cast them for Trump, i.e. have people forge electoral college vote certificates. PILF's assault on voting rights has taken many shapes, yes, over the years, from a false 2016, quote, report that published the names of over 1,000 Virginia voters that the organization claimed to be voting illegally, to its digital efforts to make election disinformation go viral. Since the 2020 election, PILF has mainly focused its resources on suing states around the country in an effort to purge voters from its election rolls. According to Democracy Docket's election litigation tracker, PILF is currently involved in 6 active cases that seek access to states' voter registration records or bar non-citizens from voting, which is already illegal in federal elections. A majority of these lawsuits, like in Colorado, Hawaii, Michigan, New York, South Carolina, and Washington, D.C., PILF is the plaintiff, or its lawyers are representing the plaintiff. But the group is also taking a smaller role in election litigation, like filing an amicus brief in support of 2 Kansas voter suppression laws facing a legal challenge by the League of Women Voters. And there's at least 8 recent closed cases that PILF had been involved in as a plaintiff, or in smaller roles like filing supporting briefs, according to our litigation tracker. Since there's no national database of voter registration, it's up to each state to independently keep accurate records and routine maintenance of its voter registration rolls, so are updating so as to remove voters who are deceased and no longer living in the state, or the National Voter Registration Act, passed in 1993, outlines the measures that states need to take in order to keep accurate voter registration records. In 2012, a bipartisan group of election officials in 7 states created an information-sharing database in order to work together to ensure voter rolls were accurate nationwide. You've heard of it before. The Electronic Registration Information Center, or ERIC, at the height of its popularity in 2022, had 32 states and the District of Columbia participating in the system, and it was hailed as an accurate and effective system for maintaining states' voter registration records by Republican and Democratic officials alike. But in late 2022, a conspiracy-laden article from a right-wing blog made numerous false claims about the accuracy of ERIC, and I thought this would be the case. Hang on just a second. False claims about the accuracy of ERIC, and it inspired a cascade of red states to withdraw from the database, a movement that democracy advocates and experts warn will make elections less secure. Side note, the link to the right-wing blog that published this conspiracy-laden article leads us to one guess. You can all do it because they've been in the news. The Gateway Pundit, thegatewaypundit.com, which is in the news currently because it has been sued into bankruptcy for this kind of misleading information. But it served its purpose, and so now it's out, and people are using lawfare in our courts to make sure that there are always headlines screaming about deceased people voting and illegal aliens voting and whatever that term may even mean, all of which is garbage and which gets dismissed after months and months of discovery, tying up the people who are supposed to be administering our elections in these garbage lawsuits and generating all those headlines. No matter. They were designed to lose. It doesn't matter. In the wake of the recent mass exodus from ERIC by red states, which is astonishing by itself, prominent election deniers and conspiracy theorists sought to exploit the situation with their own, less secure alternatives. One such person is Cleta Mitchell, PILF's chairwoman, who has championed Eagle AI. We've mentioned it before. A new software that uses unreliable data from public sources like newspaper obituary clippings to build its own list of eligible voter records in various states, which experts have warned isn't accurate and likely violates state and federal election laws. It's not surprising that Mitchell would champion a software like Eagle AI, given her own efforts with PILF to gain access to and purge voter rolls in states across the country. Though PILF, or Mitchell and her associates, rose to prominence in the Republican Party by preaching election integrity, the irony is that their efforts in the court pose a dangerous existential threat to the election process. New Jersey's chief elections officer made it clear what PILF's impact would be after the right-wing organization sued the Garden State for access to its voter rolls. Secretary of State Tahisha Way, a Democrat, again, the chief elections officer in New Jersey, she put it this way: if disclosed, this information would create a grave risk to the integrity of New Jersey's election system, which is, of course, exactly why they want to sue, to pry it loose. And in the meantime, consume all the time and resources of the administrators seeking to run elections cleanly and fairly, as they always have been run in this country. So, I know, a different angle, but an important angle. They're working from top to bottom to do anything they can to undermine trust in the judicial system, trust in our election system, and the actual ability of administrators to make sure that things are run on the up and up. And I guess what maybe they're hoping to do is force a fumble somewhere along the line. We were so busy responding to 9 months worth of expensive and expansive discovery demands from a bogus lawsuit that something somewhere got done wrong. And they'll be pointing to that and say, see, they can't be trusted to do this stuff. Hand it over to us and our AI. Everyone trusts AI, right? Oh, wow. All right. Well, time for us to wrap things up here today. And we didn't get to a million things as usual that we really wanted to. Maybe next week. I don't know. But we still got one of the Rosalind McGregor stories in the can. And, of course, a scary AI story today, if you happen to scope that one out. Maybe Justice will cover that one about, the high school athletic director framing up the local principal with AI so it looked like he was making racist statements. Have you seen that one? Holy mackerel.
You have been listening to Kagro in the morning with David.
I wouldn't be at all surprised if that was on Justice's agenda, but I can tell you what actually is coming up next on the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy with Justice Putnam. Let's see. Of course, he starts off with, they should move the Supreme Court to RNC headquarters. He, too, has got to be focused on what happened there. But don't worry, there's another collection of stories from around the country and around the world, as usual. Stay tuned.